In the golden glow of Rome's palaces, splendor seemed limitless. But it wasn't paid for in gold or marble, it was paid in silence and in bodies. Young men, barely more than boys, became living ornaments of power, their beauty sold in markets like livestock, their voices erased. Who bore the real cost of Rome's greatness? Chronicles praise emperors, but archaeology lore and whispers in the margins reveal another truth. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger of empire closes, the bones still speak. Behind the triumphal arches and temples of Rome, a hidden economy sustained the empire's image of glory. Not all slaves were destined for fields or kitchens. Some were chosen for something more intimate, more insidious. These were the concubines young men selected not for strength or skill, but for their faces, their youth, and the pliability of their silence. Their role was to adorn the households of senators, generals, and emperors, not as free companions, but as property, as possessions, who lived and died in the shadow of wealth. The Roman world exalted power above all else. Conquest filled the markets with captives. Law transformed them into commodities. Custom dictated their use. For some boys barely into their teens, capture meant being stripped of their names, their families and their futures remade into reflections of their master's desires. They could be dressed in silk-taught music and poetry or paraded as trophies at banquets. But none of it was freedom. The finery was a mask. Beneath it lay fear, coercion, and the constant knowledge that their survival depended on submission. What makes their story so haunting is not just the cruelty, but the silence. Historians of Rome praised its legions, its laws, and its marble. Rarely did they pause to consider the cost borne by those who had no voice. And yet, through scattered references, court speeches, and the grim testimony of archaeology, fragments of their lives emerge. This series will uncover that story, how Rome's concubines were chosen, controlled, displayed, punished, and forgotten. It will reveal not only the brutality of their existence, but also the resilience that flickered in the darkest corners of the empire. Life in Rome was defined by hierarchy, and nowhere was this more visible than in the household. To outsiders, a senator's domus looked like a miniature palace, mosaic floors, marble courtyards, perfumed halls where guests debated philosophy or reclined at banquets. But behind the painted walls lay a world of silence, one inhabited by people whose names history rarely recorded. Among the most invisible were the male concubines. They were not ordinary slaves, performing household labor, nor gladiators whose blood entertained the masses. Their role was more intimate, more insidious. They were trapped in a system designed to exploit their youth and beauty for the pleasure of Rome's elite. The Romans did not think about intimacy in the way modern societies do. Consent, affection, or personal choice mattered little in a world where power dictated everything. A master's desire was law. At the very bottom of this hierarchy stood the concubines, often enslaved boys or very young men. They lived in perpetual uncertainty, their bodies never their own, always subject to the whims of those who purchased them. For these boys, adolescence was not a time of learning or self-discovery, but of surveillance, coercion, and fear. What separated concubines from other enslaved workers was the totality of their objectification. A cook could at least measure his worth by the meals he prepared, a secretary by the letters he wrote. But concubines were valued only for appearance and pliability. Roman authors, when they mentioned them at all, did so in euphemisms describing them as companions or favourites. In reality, they were living adornments meant to flatter the status of their masters the way a gilded statue might. Being kept as a concubine was not a sign of affection, it was a mark of possession. The selection process was brutal from the beginning. Many of these young men were war captives seized during campaigns and sold into slavery. Others were born into it. The children of enslaved parents whose fates were decided before they could walk. Some families, crushed by debt, gave up their sons in desperation, choosing the survival of many over the freedom of one. Once purchased, a boy had no path of refusal. He was taken into a household where every detail of his existence, from hairstyle to diet, would be controlled. Their daily lives varied depending on the wealth and temperament of their masters. But uncertainty was universal. At any moment, a concubine could be summoned to appear in the atrium at a banquet or in a private chamber. He was expected not only to obey, but to perform gratitude, to appear pleased, no matter the humiliation. This psychological pressure was immense. Survival depended not just on submission, but on convincing the master of cheerful compliance. Behind every forced smile was the constant fear that displeasure might bring punishment or replacement. The contradiction of their existence was stark. To visiting guests, they might appear privileged, dressed in fine clothing, taught poetry and music, seated near their masters as if part of the family. But these privileges were illusions. The silk and gold were not gifts, but chains, reminders that they were owned, not loved. Some concubines lived in relative luxury, but even then they remained powerless, their every action dictated by another's will. Others endured conditions little better than common slaves' cramped quarters, no possessions of their own, and endless vulnerability. Perhaps most devastating was their invisibility under Roman law. Ordinary slaves at least fell into categories where some rules, however, limited applied. Concubines lived in a grey zone where the law refused to see them at all. They had no recourse to justice, no recognized right to refuse, no path to appeal. In the eyes of the state, their suffering simply did not exist. And so their lives became a theatre of silence, hidden in households that boasted of virtue, while practicing exploitation behind closed doors. This was the hidden world of concubinage, a space where beauty became a curse, where survival meant surrender, and where the grandeur of Rome was maintained at the expense of its most vulnerable. The journey into concubinage often began not in Rome itself, but on the edges of the empire, in places where Roman legions pressed their iron grip into foreign soil. For young men, conquest was not just a story of borders redrawn, it was a personal catastrophe. Villages were sacked, families torn apart, and those who survived found themselves herded towards slave markets that dotted the Mediterranean. Among the captives, certain boys were singled out, not for their strength or skill, but for their faces, their youth, their bodies, that Roman eyes deemed desirable. The markets were brutal theatres of dehumanization. Writers of antiquity compared them openly to livestock auctions, where buyers inspected not just teeth and muscles, but the smoothness of skin, the colour of hair, the symmetry of features. A child might be ordered to strip under the gaze of strangers, forced to turn bend and display himself like a prized colt. Traders promoted their captives with the same language used for animals or furniture, boasting of unspoiled youth, foreign exoticism, or the promise of obedience. To stand on that platform was to feel every shred of personhood stripped away. origins carried their own value in Roman imagination. Greek boys were often prized for supposed refinement, a reputation born from centuries of Greek culture being admired by Rome. To own a Greek concubine was to flaunt not only beauty, but also cultural prestige. Fair-haired captives from the Germanic tribes of the north fetched high prices for their exotic appearance, often described in Roman accounts with a blend of fascination and condescension. Boys from the east, from Syria or Judea, might be valued for their delicacy or their association with mystery cults and sensuality. Every ethnicity became a brand. Every origin commodified, reinforcing Rome's habit of turning difference into currency. The buyers were members of the elite senators, equestrians, wealthy freedmen who had clawed their way to fortune. For them, selecting a concubine was less about companionship than about prestige. To display a beautiful youth at a banquet or in a villa garden was to signal wealth, taste, and dominance. Masters compared their acquisitions the way they might compare estates or horses. The concubine became a walking advertisement of status, a living testament to the master's ability to possess what others could only desire. The terror for the boys themselves cannot be overstated. Many were barely into adolescence, still children in all but appearance. They arrived at the markets after long marches in chains, malnourished, frightened, and disoriented by the loss of home. Some had watched their families killed. Others had been sold by desperate parents crushed under debt. Whatever the path, the result was the same: to stand exposed before strangers, their future bargained over in coin and gesture. Once sold, there was no return. The process was also ritualized humiliation. Accounts describe buyers running hands over bodies, checking for scars or signs of resistance. Even a small defect could lower value, while perceived freshness sent prices soaring. It was common for traders to advertise a boy as untouched, knowing that Roman masters paid dearly for novelty. A new concubine carried the highest price tag, not unlike how new gladiators drew the loudest cheers. Youth itself was the commodity, fleeting and fragile. There were no legal protections against this exploitation. Roman law treated slaves as property, and concubines fell into an even murkier category, valued only for service to desire. Families had no recourse once a son was taken. Parents might never learn what became of him, their grief silenced by the distance of markets and the indifference of empire. In debt slavery cases, the transaction was cloaked in the language of necessity, one son sacrificed so that others might live. Yet, even that grim bargain offered no dignity, only despair. The concubine's fate was sealed at the moment of purchase. His master might be cruel or indulgent, ostentatious or discreet, but in every case, the boy's life ceased to be his own. Even his name was often stripped away, replaced with one chosen by the household. Sometimes a diminutive, sometimes an ironic joke, sometimes a classical name that erased his origin. With the stroke of a pen, identity was lost, replaced by the role of companion, a role that concealed exploitation behind a veil of language. From the moment of capture to the moment of purchase, the concubine was transformed from a son, a villager, a free human being, into a living ornament of Rome's elite. The market was not just a place of commerce. It was the crucible, where humanity was reduced to price, where terror was repackaged as beauty, and where Rome's hunger for pleasure fed on the despair of the conquered. What happened inside the household was another world entirely, but it always began here at the platform, where a boy stood trembling while strangers debated the shape of his future. Once a concubine was purchased, the market's public humiliation gave way to the private demands of the household. Yet, what appeared to be rescue from the platform was only the beginning of a more suffocating captivity. The boy entered through the door of a Roman domus or villa, not as a guest, but as living property, expected to mold himself into whatever role his master desired. From that moment onward, his body, and even his smallest gestures, belonged not to himself, but to the whims of another. The atmosphere inside these households varied according to wealth and personality, but all shared one constant unpredictability. Some masters flaunted their concubines, dressing them in silks, adorning them with jewelry, and parading them before guests as symbols of refinement. These youths were displayed at banquets, instructed to serve wine, entertain with music or poetry, and sit at their master's side like prized possessions. Their beauty was a centerpiece, their obedience a silent performance, their presence proof that Rome's conquests extended beyond land and gold into the intimate lives of its elite. Others concealed their concubines within the inner quarters, hidden from public eyes, but no less controlled. In these cases, the boy became a shadow figure, summoned at odd hours, dismissed without explanation, trapped in the cycle of anticipation and dread. Both extremes, public exhibition and private seclusion, were cages of different designs. Neither offered freedom or stability, only the shifting moods of those in power. Daily routines reflected this uncertainty. A concubine was expected to anticipate his master's needs before they were spoken to, sense when silence was safest and when conversation might please. For some, this meant education in letters and philosophy, not to cultivate their own minds, but to sharpen them into more entertaining companions. A concubine might learn to recite Homer, to discuss Stoic maxims, or to sing verses of love poetry. Yet every word was meant to flatter, never to express his own thought. Knowledge became another chain binding him to roles he had not chosen. Even the privileges granted were poisoned gifts. Fine clothes marked him as distinct from other slaves, but also reminded him that his beauty was on display, a costume tailored for someone else's pleasure. Access to libraries, gardens, or elegant baths was never freedom, but another stage for performance, where he was expected to embody gratitude for comforts that could vanish at a whim. Rome's cruelty lay in making the chains invisible, replacing iron shackles with silk cords, yet never loosening their grip. In grand households with multiple concubines, competition deepened the torment. Masters cultivated rivalry, favoring one youth today and discarding him tomorrow, forcing boys into jealous rivalries that corroded solidarity. To survive, each learned to act, to smile through humiliation, to mask fear with practiced charm. This atmosphere bred a constant awareness that affection was fleeting, that the slightest error could transform luxury into punishment. For those relegated to harsher masters, life was stripped of any illusion of privilege. They were confined to cramped quarters, summoned when desired, and dismissed into obscurity afterward. Here the concubine was little more than a tool, his existence reduced to obedience on demand. The fear of punishment hovered at every turn, and rumors of beatings or cruel games served as constant reminders of vulnerability. Isolation magnified the suffering. Masters often forbade concubines from forming bonds with other slaves, fearing rebellion or escape. Friendships, when they existed, were fragile and secretive, coded in glances and whispered words. To be caught showing too much attachment to another could invite punishment, even separation through sale to another household. For boys already torn from their families, this deliberate denial of new connections was a second exile, cutting them off from the very possibility of belonging. The household's architecture itself reinforced control. Roman villas were designed with hierarchical spaces, grand atriums, and dining halls for display, cramped cubicula, and service corridors for those who labored unseen. Concubines drifted between both worlds, ornament in one shadow, in the other, never truly belonging to either. Archaeological traces graffiti scratched into plaster, hidden sleeping quarters. Fragments of fine clothing found near service areas hint at this dual existence, where boys lived as both spectacle and secret. At banquets where senators debated law and generals boasted of campaigns, concubines stood silent, refilling cups, their presence treated as decoration. Laughter echoed around them, but it was not for them. The irony is striking in the same rooms where philosophers spoke of virtue justice and the duties of citizenship. Young men sat as living contradictions, evidence of a system that exalted ideals, while ignoring the humanity at its core. Some concubines learned to craft survival strategies, to flatter skillfully, to conceal pain behind practiced expressions, to guess a master's desires with uncanny precision. These strategies could mean the difference between comfort and cruelty, but they also required a suppression of self so profound that the boy's own identity risked being extinguished. What remained was a performance, a mask worn for so long that it fused with the skin. The household was not simply a place of residence. It was a crucible of control. Within its walls, wealth and power were rehearsed daily, and concubines became part of that theatre. They were not partners in pleasure, nor even fully slaves in the traditional sense. They were something more insidious. Living symbols of dominance beauty consumed. As proof of conquest, bodies remade into ornaments of Rome's grandeur. Behind the marble columns and painted frescoes, every gesture was calculated, every privilege conditional, every kindness suspect. For the concubine life inside the household was an endless performance where the audience was a single, powerful master, and the cost of failure was everything. Once inside the household, the master's true power was not only physical, but psychological. Roman elites understood that to maintain dominance over another human being, fear alone was not enough. Control worked best when it shaped the mind as well as the body, when obedience became instinct rather than command. For concubines, this meant living under a system of manipulation that twisted kindness into a weapon and privileges into shackles. Privileges were never given freely. They were granted and withdrawn in cycles designed to keep the youth uncertain, anxious, and pliable. A concubine might be offered a fine cloak one day, then stripped of it the next for some perceived slight. He might be allowed to sit close at a banquet basking in temporary approval, only to be banished to the shadows the following night. The oscillation between favor and rejection was deliberate, breaking down resistance and fostering dependency. To survive, a boy learned to cling to fleeting rewards, even as he feared their loss. Isolation deepened this control. Masters often barred concubines from forming friendships with other slaves or even with each other. A kind word exchanged in the courtyard, a glance of sympathy in the kitchen. Such moments were risky. If discovered, punishments followed separation beatings or sale to another household. By cutting off bonds of solidarity, masters ensured that each concubine felt alone, unable to imagine escape or collective resistance. This loneliness was itself a form of captivity, a second set of invisible chains. where multiple concubines existed in a single household competition, was carefully nurtured. Masters pitted boys against one another, rewarding one with attention while neglecting another. The effect was corrosive, instead of solidarity. There was rivalry, instead of shared suffering, jealousy. Each concubine lived under the unspoken threat that another could take his place at any moment. This atmosphere of suspicion kept them vigilant, striving to please, too busy, surviving to rebel. Masters did not need to raise the whip. Often fear of being discarded or replaced was enough to ensure obedience. The economy of control also relied on unpredictability. A concubine never knew which version of his master he would face, the generous patron or the vindictive tyrant. This uncertainty bred a constant state of anxiety, a readiness to perform gratitude, a vigilance against error. Even moments of apparent tenderness were double-edged, for affection could sour instantly into punishment. Over time, this whiplash of moods eroded the boundary between reality and performance, leaving the youth trapped in a cycle where fear and gratitude became indistinguishable. Roman writers, when they acknowledged this dynamic at all, often described it as training in loyalty, as though these boys were fortunate to be molded by their masters. But the truth lay in silence, in the quiet erosion of self. The concubine's smile, his polished manners, his eagerness to serve all were rehearsed under duress. Every act of charm was survival. Every show of gratitude, a mask. It was not loyalty that masters created, but dependence. Not affection, but fear dressed in finery. The cruelty of this system is clear when seen against the broader culture of Rome. Elites prided themselves on discipline and self-mastery, yet they practiced psychological games designed to unmake the self of others. The irony is bitter. Those who preached about virtus and dignitas engineered conditions that stripped dignity from the most vulnerable. For the concubine life was not simply obedience to orders, but obedience to moods, whims, and the invisible economy of favor and fear. What emerged from this system was not just exploitation of the body, but captivity of the mind. The boy's desires no longer mattered. His hopes shrank to the scale of his master's approval. In a world where even a smile or a cloak could vanish without cause, dependency became a form of survival. Rome's genius lay not only in its armies and laws, but in its ability to make domination feel natural, to make obedience feel inevitable. For concubines, this was the cruelest economy of all. An endless trade where their silence bought another day of survival, and their submission became the coin that Rome demanded. Rome liked to call itself the school of the world, the air of Greece, the beacon of civilization. But for concubines, education was not a gift of enlightenment, it was another instrument of control. Masters knew that beauty could fade, but entertainment had to endure. A concubine's mind was trained not to liberate him, but to refine him into a more polished ornament, a more valuable possession. Some were taught to read and write, but never for their own purposes. Literacy allowed them to recite poetry, to copy verses, to deliver witty remarks at banquets that reflected well on their owners. They learned fragments of Homer and lines from Virgil not to think, but to perform. A concubine was expected to flatter guests by quoting philosophy, to debate trivial questions with elegance, and to play the role of cultured companion while the household watched. It was theatre disguised as learning, a mask of sophistication masking the absence of freedom. Music was another favoured training. A concubine might be taught the lyre, the flute, or singing his voice, becoming another tool to charm visitors. To entertain in this way was not voluntary, it was demanded. His talents belonged to the master, and every note he played was a reminder that his body and mind had been remade for someone else's pleasure. Even dance, at times erotic, became part of this training. What in another culture might have been art was twisted here into performance for domination. Education extended to manners. Concubines were instructed in the delicate arts of conversation, how to respond with modesty but never dullness, how to praise without seeming cloying, how to laugh at the right moment, how to soften a master's temper with words. It was not about truth or personality, but about crafting a mask of obedience wrapped in charm. Masters wanted companions who could reflect their wit, amplify their pride, and provide them with the illusion of intimacy without ever challenging authority. The body too was subjected to relentless cultivation. Diets were imposed to maintain slender youth or muscular grace depending on the master's taste. Exercise routines kept their forms appealing even if the concubines themselves were weary. Grooming became a daily ritual, plucking hair, oiling skin, trimming nails. These were not luxuries, but obligations, tasks enforced with the same severity as temple rituals. A blemish, a scar, or weight gained in the wrong places could bring scorn, punishment, or even sale. Some masters demanded cosmetic interventions that would horrify us today. There are accounts of skin lightened with dangerous powders of oils and perfumes rubbed in until they caused rashes, of rudimentary surgical practices that attempted to alter features to fit Roman ideals of beauty. Without anesthesia, without hygiene, such procedures were painful and often disfiguring. But the master's desire overruled the concubine's suffering. His body was clay to be molded no matter the cost. Clothing became another form of bondage. Silks, dyed fabrics, and fine tunics might seem like gifts, but they were symbols of ownership. To dress a concubine in gold-threaded robes was to declare wealth, not to honor the wearer. Jewelry gleamed on his neck or wrists like gilded chains, ornament that reminded everyone of who truly possessed him. Archaeological finds of delicate bracelets and anklets, inscribed with owners' initials, show how adornment doubled as branding luxury wrapped around servitude. Even when paraded in finery, the concubine understood the truth. The beauty on display was not his to command. It belonged to his master's ego. Guests might marvel at the silk robe, the polished manners, the sweet music, but all were directed back to the master who had created such refinement. The concubine was a mirror, reflecting glory that was not his own. The cruelty of this system lay in its contradictions. The same society that taught him letters refused to let him write his own destiny. The same culture that polished his voice silenced his words when they did not please. His appearance was perfected until he gleamed like marble, yet he was treated as less than human stone. Rome's education for him was not a pathway to citizenship or honor, but an alchemy of control, turning suffering into spectacle, turning a boy into an ornament. In the end, the concubine's greatest lesson was not in poetry or music, but in performance. He learned to smile when he wanted to cry, to flatter when he wanted to rage, to adorn himself as if he were proud, while knowing he was trapped. Every word, every gesture, every costume was part of the lesson to exist not for himself, but as the living decoration of Rome's power. To an outsider, the life of a concubine in the household of a Roman elite might appear enviable. draped in silks perfumed with rare oils, eating delicacies from silver platters, and travelling across the empire in carriages or aboard private ships, these trappings suggested privilege. But privilege is not freedom. For concubines, luxury was a cage of gold. Every fine robe was a uniform, every banquet seat a stage, every journey another reminder that beauty bound them as tightly as iron chains. Travel in particular revealed the paradox of this existence. Wealthy Romans were constantly in motion between their townhouses in Rome villas in the countryside and estates scattered across the provinces. Concubines accompanied them as portable symbols of status. When the master arrived in Ostia to set sail for Capri, or marched in retinue to a country estate in Campania, the youth was paraded alongside baggage and retainers. He was displayed in public, an accessory to his owner's grandeur. But he travelled not as a guest, never as a free companion. He was cargo with a pulse, expected to perform charm in unfamiliar cities, to adapt instantly to new audiences, to embody the wealth of his master wherever they went. The golden cage was reinforced by constant display. At banquets, concubines were dressed in robes dyed purple or crimson shades reserved for prestige. Guests admired not just the boy's beauty, but the owner's power in possessing him. To offer a concubine's performance of song or poetry after dinner was to underline dominance. See what I own. See how even culture and youth bow to my wealth. The boy's every smile, every note played, every graceful gesture was a reflection not of himself, but of his master's vanity. Even luxuries that might seem indulgent fine food, soft bedding, warm baths were laced with coercion. Meals were eaten under scrutiny, diets enforced for appearance rather than health. Baths were places of surveillance as much as cleansing, where attendants monitored grooming to ensure the body matched the master's desires. Even rest was conditional. A concubine could be summoned at any hour. Comforts existed not to nurture him, but to maintain his readiness as a living ornament. Historical anecdotes sharpen this truth. Suetonius, in his biographies of emperors, hints at the way concubines were treated as treasures displayed like plate or furniture. The Emperor Domitian was said to stage elaborate feasts where enslaved youths chosen for their beauty reclined with jewels draped across their bare skin to impress senators and visiting envoys. To the onlookers, it was spectacle. To the concubines, it was performance without choice. In other elite houses, masters used concubines as tokens of hospitality. Lending a favored youth to a visiting friend for an evening was presented as generosity. But for the concubine, it was a reminder that his body was never his own. It was a gift that could be given away at will. Archaeology too offers silent testimony. In the villas of Pompeii and Herculaneum, frescoes depict banquets where lithe young figures serve wine or play the lyre beside reclining masters. Their features are stylized, idealized, but the context is unmistakable beauty woven into the fabric of display bodies as decoration in painted form, just as in life. The walls preserved by volcanic ash echo the reality that concubines lived daily luxury as spectacle service, as artifice identity, erased beneath ornament. To the concubines themselves, this gilded existence carried a deeper cruelty. Poverty and hunger were not their chains. It was the illusion of privilege. They could see and touch luxury, but never claim it. A robe of silk did not mean freedom to walk Rome's streets. A jeweled ring did not give them the power to make a contract or speak in court. They ate delicacies, yet remained property. They reclined in marble villas, yet could not call a single room their own. Their cage was not rusted iron, but polished bronze, gleaming and inescapable. The contradiction was brutal. Rome exalted them as symbols of refinement, but denied them the rights, even of ordinary slaves. Gladiators, at least, could win fame in the arena, sometimes even freedom. Household slaves could earn manumission through service. But concubines existed in a space where their very role, bound to their youth and beauty, guaranteed transience. Their value was tied to time's cruelest measure: how long they could remain desirable. The gilded cage also demanded performance of gratitude. A concubine who frowned at fine gifts, who resisted silks or jewels, risked punishment for ingratitude. He was expected to smile when presented with golden chains, as though chains became less binding for being beautiful. Masters used luxury as proof of generosity, silencing whispers of cruelty with glittering surfaces. To resist or resent was to bite the hand that fed a hand that could easily cast him aside. Seen from afar, the life of a concubine might have looked like fortune, but the closer one stepped, the more visible the bars of the cage became. What glittered was not opportunity, but possession. What shimmered in silk was not dignity, but display. Rome was adept at cloaking its cruelties in beauty, turning domination into theatre. For the concubines who lived inside this spectacle, luxury was not liberation. It was the very shape of their prison. Behind every concubine standing in a Roman villa was an absence, a gap torn in a family or community far away. Rome's appetite for beauty did not only consume individuals. It reached deep into villages, households, and cultures, stripping them of sons, unraveling bonds that had once held people together. The cost of concubinage was never confined to the enslaved youth alone. It radiated outward, wounding those left behind and erasing the roots that gave identity meaning. For many, the journey into concubinage began with debt. Families crushed by taxes, drought, or war faced impossible choices. In parts of the empire where subsistence farming left little margin for survival, parents sometimes surrendered a son to creditors in exchange for relief. This was not framed as slavery, but as necessity cloaked in legal euphemism. Yet, everyone understood what it meant. A child would vanish from the family, his body converted into payment. To hand over a son was an act of desperation, one that carried shame but also grief. A father might hope his boy would be treated well in Rome, but more often the reality was silence. Letters rarely came. Rumors of markets and abuse trickled back, confirming what parents feared but could not prevent. Communities too felt the loss. In conquered provinces, raids by slavers or armies could strip villages of their youth in a single day. What remained were broken households, mothers, bereft siblings, confused fathers, humiliated at their inability to protect. The memory of sons taken hung like a wound that never healed. In some places, entire generations of boys vanished into Rome's hunger for labor and beauty, leaving echoes in the demographic record. Archaeologists studying settlement layers in Gaul and Asia Minor have noted skewed age distributions, hints of mass removals. What Rome saw as commerce, local people experienced as rupture, the steady bleeding away of life. Once in Rome, the process of erasure intensified. Masters deliberately stripped concubines of their former identities. Names were Romanized or replaced with diminutives, Felix Secundus Puer. Ethnic markers that once tied them to homeland were erased in favor of labels that suited the master's household. A German boy might become Albus for his pale hair a Greek sophos for wit, but these were not acknowledgements of heritage. They were nicknames that domesticated difference, folding foreignness into Roman control. To lose a name was to lose a past, and with it, the thread that connected a person to their kin and culture. The concubine's accent dress and customs were likewise reshaped. He was taught Roman manners, Roman speech, Roman gestures of deference. Whatever language he had spoken with his mother became a private memory, discouraged or mocked in the household. Rituals of his homeland songs, prayers, ways of eating were suppressed. Masters wanted pliant companions who reflected their own world, not reminders of foreign cultures. Slowly, the concubine was remade, not only as property, but as a cultural void, his roots severed to ensure loyalty only to the master. Yet, traces of resistance persisted. Graffiti scratched by enslaved youths in the margins of Roman cities sometimes preserve non-Latin names or words, hidden declarations of identity that refused erasure. In one case from Pompeii, a wall bears the scrawled Greek name of a boy, alongside crude drawings, perhaps the only surviving trace of someone whose official identity was stolen. These tiny acts of memory were fragile but defiant attempts to carve permanence in a world intent on forgetting. The emotional cost of this severing cannot be overstated. For the boy to lose family and name was to drift in a limbo where he belonged nowhere. He was not Roman, never fully accepted, nor was he any longer tied to his native community from which he was physically and culturally estranged. He became in essence a ghost of two worlds, existing only in the space of servitude. Masters exploited this dislocation, reminding concubines that they had nowhere else to go, that their survival depended wholly on remaining desirable and obedient. In Rome, some concubines might have heard faint whispers of their homeland in the voices of other slaves, in market stalls, or in the accents of soldiers returning from campaigns. These echoes could stir longing, but also pain. Reminders of families who grieved their absence. To imagine one's mother, aging siblings growing up, a village moving on without them, was to feel the weight of exile pressing on every gesture. The irony is that Rome, the empire that prided itself on absorbing cultures, did so by hollowing out the very people who embodied them. Concubines were not simply enslaved. They were uprooted, reshaped, and silenced until their identities dissolved into the vast machinery of Roman power. The cost was not measured only in lives consumed, but in languages lost, in songs unsung, in families permanently broken. Thus, the story of Rome's concubines is not only a tale of individual suffering, it is the story of mothers who never saw their sons again, of fathers who lost heirs of villages scarred by absence. It is the story of identities unmade so that Rome could preen itself with trophies of flesh. The empire's splendor gleamed, but beneath its marble shimmer lay the shadows of families torn apart and boys remade into strangers to themselves. If luxury was the mask that concealed servitude, punishment was the iron that reminded concubines of their place. Rome's elites believed ownership gave them absolute authority, and discipline was exercised without restraint. For concubines, the threat of punishment was constant, a shadow that hung over even their most gilded moments. Behind the silks and perfumes lay fear of displeasure, of rebellion, suspected, of escape attempted. Escape was the ultimate act of desperation, and Rome responded with calculated cruelty. Concubines who tried to flee were hunted with the same urgency as runaway gladiators or valuable slaves. When captured, their punishment was made into a spectacle to deter others. Branding was common hot irons pressed against the forehead, chest, or thighs to inscribe marks of shame. The scar was permanent, a living proclamation of disobedience, ensuring that even if sold, the boy carried his failure visibly for all to see. Some punishments were even more theatrical. Historical sources describe runaway slaves nailed to wooden boards, left to die slowly, as warnings in marketplaces or along roads. Though concubines were rarer and more valuable, the principle was the same. Disobedience was to be displayed. A boy who tried to seize freedom could find himself exposed, humiliated, reduced to an example rather than a person. But the cruelty extended beyond physical pain. Public humiliation was itself a weapon. A concubine might be paraded half-naked through the streets, mocked by crowds who saw in him not a victim, but a curiosity. Roman society, accustomed to gladiators bleeding for entertainment, showed little pity for those who broke the rules of servitude. The master's wrath was understood as law within the household, and society rarely interfered. Suicide was another path some concubines sought, desperate for release from a life they did not choose. Yet, even this final act of autonomy was often denied. Masters regarding concubines as investments took steps to prevent self-destruction. They removed sharp objects, supervised their movements, and confined them in guarded quarters when despair seemed evident. To attempt suicide was framed not as a cry of pain, but as theft, an attempt to steal value from the master by destroying his property. Survival itself became coerced, a duty imposed even when life had become unbearable. Psychological punishments could be as devastating as physical ones. Privileges withdrawn, isolation, enforced threats whispered. These were tools as sharp as the lash. Masters might feign affection one day and turn cold the next, forcing concubines to walk a trembling line between hope and dread. This constant instability, this deliberate shattering of trust, wore down resistance more effectively than blows. To live under such conditions was to live in perpetual vigilance, never knowing when kindness might turn to cruelty. Archaeological evidence hints at these realities. In inscriptions describing manumission, rare cases when concubines or favored slaves were freed, there are phrases that suggest discipline, corrected for disobedience, punished for flight. These euphemisms veil violence beneath formal language, but they reveal the constant danger. Even in freedom, scars, physical and emotional, remained. Bones found in Roman sites sometimes bear marks of repeated trauma fractures, poorly healed teeth, broken skulls cracked. Each speaks to a life in which the body absorbed blows meant not just to wound, but to control. The desperation of concubines cannot be separated from this atmosphere of punishment. To endure meant crafting strategies for survival, concealing despair, masking anger, feigning joy. But the knowledge that punishment could strike for the smallest offense, an ill-timed glance, a hesitation, a refusal meant that their existence was fraught with tension. Death hovered near, not as freedom, but as threat. In Rome's moral calculus, obedience was worth more than life. A concubine could be adorned in jewels and silks, yet, at the first hint of disobedience, he could be stripped bare and branded. His worth was conditional, contingent on silence and compliance. To attempt escape or resist was to gamble with agony. The golden cage always contained a whip, hidden in its shadows. In the end, punishment and desperation were not aberrations of the system, but its pillars. They maintained the illusion of consent, ensured that performance continued, and reminded every concubine that survival hinged not on dignity, but on submission. Rome demanded not just their bodies, but their fear. In Rome's glittering halls, where marble busts of philosophers proclaimed wisdom and virtue, the bodies of concubines told another story, one of maintenance without mercy. These young men were property, and like prized racehorses or finely crafted armor, they were cared for only to the extent that their appearance and performance could be preserved. When their beauty served profit or prestige, attention was lavished upon them. When their health faltered beyond repair, neglect set in swiftly. Medical care was never a matter of compassion. It was calculated investment. Masters summoned physicians, not out of kindness, but to preserve the value of their possession. A concubine's body had to remain smooth, unscarred, and pliant. His skin was expected to glow with youth, his form to radiate vitality. If illness or injury threatened that facade, treatment might be arranged, but only insofar as it protected the master's image and investment. Roman medicine itself was a mixture of genuine skill, superstition, and cruelty. The empire's physicians, drawing on Greek texts, knew how to stitch wounds, set bones, and prepare herbal remedies. But they also relied on treatments that we would find barbaric. Concubines could be subjected to bloodletting, burning with heated irons to balance humors, or forced consumption of concoctions that poisoned as often as they healed. To the young men enduring such care, the pain of the treatment was often as terrifying as the ailment itself. Grooming was a daily ordeal, masked as beautification. Hair was plucked or shaved to meet ideals of youth. Perfumes rubbed into skin to disguise the odors of fear and sweat. Some were forced to undergo primitive cosmetic procedures, scarification, scraping, even surgeries designed to accentuate features considered desirable. These interventions, performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, left wounds that could fester. Infections spread easily in the close, humid quarters of Roman villas. Yet masters rarely cared as long as the boy could still be paraded in silk at feasts. Diet was another form of imposed medical regimen. Concubines were ordered to eat or refrain from foods depending on their master's preferences. Some were force-fed rich meals to plump their cheeks or smooth their skin, while others were starved to preserve a thin adolescent figure. Malnutrition and digestive illness were common outcomes of these manipulations, but complaints were met with punishment rather than sympathy. Food, like clothing, was an ornament of ownership, not nourishment of the soul. Pain was ignored if it did not interfere with utility. A broken rib from punishment might be wrapped, but rarely treated properly. A cracked tooth could rot in the mouth, breath souring until the boy was no longer fit for close company. Then, and only then, might the tooth be yanked with brutal force by a slave healer. The purpose was never comfort. It was preservation of the master's enjoyment. The absence of legal protection compounded the cruelty. Roman law offered no recourse for concubines. They existed in a legal grey space, invisible as citizens and even as slaves with recognized duties. Their suffering was unrecorded, their voices silenced by design. If a master's treatment maimed or killed them, the law did not intervene. No charges were brought, no compensation was owed. The loss was considered no more significant than the death of a hunting dog or the breaking of a prized goblet. Archaeological evidence whispers of these neglected bodies. Excavations of Roman burial sites have revealed skeletons of young men with spinal deformities, the result of forced postures and heavy labor alongside enforced performance. Others show signs of repeated infections, bone lesions, and untreated fractures. In some graves, the presence of luxury items rings. Pendant suggests they were once adorned concubines laid down without honor, their ornaments outliving their flesh. One chilling truth emerges from these remains. Medical care extended only as far as profitability. When illness consumed them beyond recovery, when the sheen of youth faded, they were no longer worthy of attention. Neglect became abandonment. Masters sold them off cheaply, discarded them to lower households, or simply let them waste away in silence. The glitter of their silk robes gave way to the rags of irrelevance. The psychological damage of such neglect was no less severe than the physical. To know that one's life was valued only for beauty, that pain mattered only if it disrupted service, was to live in a perpetual state of disposability. Concubines learned that their bodies were not their own, and that even their survival depended on remaining pleasing. In this system, medicine was not healing. It was another chain. In Rome, care and cruelty were two faces of the same coin. A concubine could be adorned in gold one day and left to die of fever the next. His body was a stage, his health a calculation, his suffering invisible. In the eyes of the empire, he was not a man in need of care, but a commodity to be maintained, neglected, or discarded at will. The story of Rome's concubines cannot be understood without following the chains that carried them there. Their suffering began long before the villa, before the silken robes and the gilded cages. It began in the networks of capture and commerce that stretched across the Mediterranean, feeding the Roman appetite for youth and beauty. Rome's wealth was built not only on conquest of land, but on conquest of bodies, and the concubine trade reveals how systematic that process became. The supply chain was vast, fed by war piracy and debt. When Roman legions swept through Greece, Asia Minor, or the Germanic frontiers, they returned not only with spoils of gold, but with prisoners. Among them were boys chosen for their looks, their youth, their vulnerability. Captivity stripped them of identity in an instant. To the victors, they were no longer sons or brothers, but potential luxuries to be displayed at banquets trained for companionship or paraded as emblems of power. Kidnapping supplemented the trade. Pirates roamed the Aegean and Tyrrhenian seas, snatching children from coastal villages. These victims were not random. Demand shaped supply. Traders knew wealthy Romans prized fair-skinned northerners and educated Greeks, so they targeted accordingly. A single youth who matched elite preferences could fetch sums greater than entire groups of ordinary slaves. Families left behind were left shattered, powerless against forces too vast to fight. Debt slavery filled yet another channel. In regions under Roman control, poor families faced impossible choices. To preserve their households from starvation, they might surrender a son to creditors. These agreements, written into contracts, reduced human beings to collateral. For the family, it was both grief and calculation sacrifice one child to save the others. For the boy, it was the erasure of his name, his freedom, his future, once captured or sold. Many of these boys entered training schools, grim institutions that mirrored the gladiator ludi. Just as fighters were conditioned for the arena, concubines were conditioned for the household. Here, they were taught to obey without question, to move with grace, to speak in ways pleasing to Roman elites. Greek tutors might instruct them in reciting poetry or playing the lyre. Others learned how to pour wine, how to read moods in their master's eyes, how to flatter and entertain. But beneath the veneer of culture, the purpose was the same: to transform a child into a compliant ornament. The process was brutal. Resistance was beaten out of them. Those who cried for home, who clung to memories of family, were punished until silence replaced defiance. Older concubines, already broken, served as enforcers and examples, living warnings of what awaited those who refused to bend. Over time, the boys' identities were reshaped. Their original languages were discouraged, replaced with Latin or polished Greek. Their given names vanished, replaced by Roman diminutives. The erasure was total, designed to produce not a person, but a symbol of luxury. Traders and masters understood the market in precise economic terms. Records survive of slaves priced by age, origin, and beauty. A boy from Germania with striking features might command a premium, a Greek youth praised for refinement even more. Inscriptions and documents from Delos and Ephesus show evidence of such transactions. Each sale was both a business deal and a human tragedy, the culmination of an infrastructure of suffering. Archaeology offers fragments of this trade's reality. In coastal markets, remains of auction blocks and iron shackles testify to the traffic in flesh. Graffiti depicts boys with exaggerated features, their beauty commodified in crude sketches. These marks on stone echo what the bones in graves confirm: that young men were moved, trained and consumed by a system as deliberate as it was cruel. For the Romans, this network was not hidden. It was normalized. Senators could debate law by day and purchase youths at night without contradiction. Philosophers could argue about the nature of virtue while ignoring the cries from markets and schools. The trade was woven into the empire's fabric, a silent but constant river of human suffering sustaining its grandeur. The concubine schools perfected what conquest and commerce had begun. They erased individuality, instilled obedience, and delivered to Rome young men already broken to the harness. When they entered a household, they did so not as strangers, but as products trained, conditioned, and priced. Their journey from capture to cage reveals the true machinery of Rome's pleasure, an empire that turned the vulnerability of boys into currency and their pain into luxury. Within the villa walls, survival was not simply a matter of enduring the body's burdens, it was an art of the mind. Concubines lived in a world where every gesture, every word, every glance could mean the difference between privilege and punishment. To live even a few years longer, they had to become masters of adaptation, shaping their behavior to the shifting moods of men who controlled every aspect of their lives. Some concubines survived by adopting masks. They learned to smile when they wanted to weep, to express gratitude for gifts that were chains in disguise, to show delight when their souls recoiled. Masters expected not only obedience, but the performance of affection, and to refuse that play was to invite danger. These boys became actors on a stage of servitude, forced to improvise daily in roles they never chose. Their performances were so seamless that outsiders sometimes mistook compliance for contentment. Yet behind those masks lay exhaustion, the relentless pressure of suppressing one's true self. Others relied on the power of silence. In households filled with intrigue, gossip, and shifting alliances, silence could shield them. speaking too freely risked angering a master or betraying another concubine. By keeping their thoughts hidden, they preserved fragments of dignity. Silence became a weapon, an act of resistance, invisible to those who thought they had stripped them of every choice. Still, survival often required communication, but in secret codes. Concubines developed subtle signals: a hand brushed against the robe, a glance across a courtyard, a whispered phrase that seemed ordinary but carried warning. These quiet exchanges created networks of empathy in an environment designed to isolate them. Through such codes, they shared advice, alerted each other to a master's foul mood, or offered comfort when words were forbidden. These fragile threads of connection wove a hidden fabric of solidarity invisible to the powerful but vital for endurance. Some concubines sought alliances with servants outside their ranks. Kitchen workers, bath attendants, or scribes could sometimes offer small favors: a stolen piece of food, a brief message delivered an ointment for a wound. These bonds, though risky, expanded survival networks. Yet, they were fragile, for betrayal was always a possibility. Rome's system thrived on division, and masters often encouraged distrust among slaves to prevent unity. Performance of culture became another tool. A concubine who recited poetry flawlessly, who played the lyre sweetly, or who quoted philosophers at the right moment might secure a measure of safety. Culture was currency, and those who mastered it could buy themselves time. Yet this too was double-edged. The very skills that prolonged survival reinforced the role of entertainer, deepening the chains of dependency. There were also quiet rebellions. Some feigned illness to escape duties for a day. Others deliberately made small mistakes in tasks testing boundaries in ways that would not provoke deadly punishment, but allowed them to assert fragments of agency. A poorly tuned instrument, a slight pause before answering tiny acts that reminded them they were still human, capable of choice, even within the cage. Dreams and memory offered another form of survival. To remember a mother's voice, a father's embrace, a homeland's songs, these became lifelines. In the dark silence of their quarters, some whispered old prayers in forbidden tongues, reviving a past Rome sought to erase. Memory was defiance proof that the masters could not completely extinguish identity. In preserving even fragments of who they were, concubines resisted total annihilation of the self. Yet, perhaps the most common strategy was submission, the outward performance of contentment. Many concubines learned that by anticipating whims flattering egos and presenting themselves as eager companions, they could reduce the risk of punishment. This performance blurred lines until even they struggled to distinguish between survival and surrender. Was the smile a mask, or had years of wearing it carved it into truth? Survival demanded not just acting, but forgetting, erasing parts of the self to remain alive in the role forced upon them. Historians often search for open revolts, for bold escapes and defiance. But in the concubine's world, survival itself was a rebellion. Each day lived despite the weight of silence. Each whispered signal of solidarity, each memory preserved in the heart was an act of resistance against a system designed to erase them. Rome's records remain silent, but archaeology and human empathy let us glimpse these strategies, faint shadows of resilience in the face of overwhelming power. To live in such a world was not merely to endure, but to navigate a labyrinth of fear, deceit, and quiet defiance. These concubines did not choose their roles, but they chose again and again not to be extinguished. Their survival strategies, though small and hidden, testify to the resilience of human dignity even in its most fragile form. For Rome's concubines, youth was both the lure that drew them into bondage and the clock that counted down toward their eventual erasure. The empire's appetite was for beauty in bloom, not in decline. Every day, a concubine lived under the tyranny of time, knowing that each year of survival also brought him closer to the moment when his body no longer pleased and his value withered. In the beginning, their youth was cultivated, polished like a jewel. They were dressed in silks, perfumed with exotic oils, paraded as ornaments of status. Masters relished showing off their prized companions, inviting dinner guests to admire their elegance or comment on their refinement. Yet, admiration was conditional. When the smoothness of skin roughened, when the hairline thinned, or the voice deepened, the jewel lost its shine. No amount of training or loyalty could preserve what Rome most desired: the illusion of eternal youth. When beauty faded, concubines were often discarded without hesitation. Some were sold to lower status households where conditions were harsher and the veneer of luxury stripped away. There they might be forced into ordinary labor or reduced to common prostitution, their former silks replaced by coarse tunics. For men who had once been prized possessions of senators or wealthy patricians, the descent was brutal, a stark reminder of how fleeting their privilege had been. Others were simply abandoned. Once their bodies no longer served the pleasures of their masters, they could be released into the streets with nothing: no money, no status, no family. Stripped of support, many died quickly, swallowed by hunger or disease. Archaeologists have uncovered unmarked graves of young men in their late 20s or early 30s, buried without offerings or markers, their anonymity reflecting how little they mattered once their usefulness had ended. A rare few were manumitted, granted freedom by a master who felt generosity or guilt. Yet freedom carried its own chains. A man once known as a concubine bore the stigma of his past. Roman society, quick to enjoy their company in secret, was just as quick to shun them in public. They might be denied marriage to respectable women, excluded from civic life, or whispered about in marketplaces. Freedom for them was often a lonely exile. The tragedy of aging was not only physical, but psychological. Concubines were taught from childhood that their worth was bound to their beauty. When that beauty faded, they faced an identity collapse. Who were they without the silks, the perfumes, the adoring but possessive glances? Some fell into despair, unable to rebuild lives after years of forced dependency. Others attempted to cling to their roles, painting their faces, dyeing their hair, striving to hold on to a youth that time had already stolen. Their efforts were often ridiculed, cruelly mocked as pathetic by the very society that had once consumed their bodies. Roman writers rarely recorded these endings. The silence itself is telling. Concubines were celebrated when young, invisible, when old. Their stories vanish from the page, suggesting that their final years were not considered worth remembering. But the bones unearthed in Roman sites tell a different story. Skeletons with signs of malnutrition, arthritis, and untreated injuries. Men who lived long enough to grow old, but not long enough to be honored. The trajectory was nearly always the same: a gilded cage that glittered for a few years, followed by a garbage heap of neglect. From prized companion to discarded body, the arc of their lives exposed the hypocrisy of a culture that idolized beauty while denying humanity. Yet, within this tragic pattern lies a truth about Rome itself. The empire consumed not only the resources of its provinces, but also the very lives of its people, feeding on them until nothing remained. The concubines' aging and disposal mirrored the empire's relentless appetite, always demanding, never satisfied, discarding what no longer pleased. For these men, time was not a gentle passage, but a countdown to oblivion. In their youth, they were trophies. In their age, they were refuse. The silence of Rome's records may try to erase them, but the truth is clear. Their beauty was never theirs to keep, and their decline was never mourned. Rome prided itself on being not only a city of power, but a city of ideas. Its senators debated law, its generals strategized empire, and its philosophers filled scrolls with reflections on justice, virtue, and the good life. Stoics preached self-control. Epicureans spoke of moderation, and orators like Cicero thundered about duty to the Republic. Yet, in the shadow of their villas, concubines lived lives that made a mockery of these lofty ideals. The silence of philosophers, or worse, their complicity, reveals the selective morality of Rome. Consider the Stoics, who taught that all humans shared a spark of divine reason. Seneca, tutor to Nero, wrote pages on mercy, restraint, and the dignity of the soul. Yet, Seneca himself lived in a world where young men were bought and sold, where his own emperor paraded boys as concubines before the court. Did the philosopher's ink ever blot the page in protest? If so, no record survives. The contradiction was profound. A culture capable of imagining universal brotherhood, yet unwilling to extend that principle to those in its own kitchens and chambers. Epicureans, meanwhile, sought pleasure without harm. They believed in friendship as the highest good, and in the avoidance of suffering as wisdom. Yet, the Roman elite twisted these teachings into justification for indulgence. Pleasure was taken without concern, for consent suffering ignored as irrelevant. A concubine forced to pour wine and recite verse was framed as part of a philosophical symposium, as though learning and cruelty could share the same couch. Even rhetoric betrayed blindness. Cicero, who thundered against tyranny, once spoke of slavery as an unfortunate but natural part of human society. To him, justice applied to citizens. Others were excluded by definition. This narrowing of moral vision allowed Rome's greatest minds to polish words of virtue while stepping over boys whose lives contradicted every sentence. Some philosophers did acknowledge the cruelty of slavery in general. Epictetus himself, once a slave, spoke bitterly of chains and the degradation of bondage. But even his voice, radical in many ways, did not break the silence on concubinage. Perhaps the shame was too heavy, the practice too embedded, the audience too unwilling to listen. Perhaps to speak would have risked ridicule, or worse, silence from those who profited. The hypocrisy ran deeper still. Rome's culture of spectacle glorified suffering in the amphitheatre. Gladiators bled to death, while philosophers composed treatises on courage. Charioteers risked their lives, while senators applauded. And in the villa, a concubine performed the role of docile companion, while Stoics discoursed on freedom of the soul. The empire was built on compartmentalization virtue in theory, exploitation in practice. Archaeological remains echo this blindness. In the ruins of villas, frescoes show symposiums with musicians, dancers, and attendants, likely concubines depicted not as individuals but as decorative figures. Their humanity flattened into ornament, their presence normalized into art. To the philosophers dining under these frescoes, the decoration was unremarkable. That silence is its own philosophy, one of convenience, of deliberate forgetting. This selective morality was not unique to Rome. Throughout history, societies have boasted ideals while exploiting the vulnerable, but Rome illustrates the contradiction in stark relief. Its philosophers gave the world enduring ideas about law, reason and virtue, while ignoring the cries within their own households. The brilliance of Roman thought shines all the brighter when set against the shadows. It refused to illuminate. In that blindness, concubines paid the price. Their suffering was dismissed as irrelevant to debates about justice. Their humanity was excluded from definitions of the soul. Their silence became the condition for others' eloquence. Rome's intellectuals could imagine universal order while erasing the very individuals whose lives most tested their claims. This is the final cruelty of philosophy in Rome, not that it invented exploitation, but that it cloaked it in silence. By looking away, by writing around rather than into the suffering of concubines, Rome's thinkers left a gap as wide as the gulf between marble ideals and flesh and blood reality. And in that gap, countless voices were lost. The empire that gave us aqueducts, laws, and literature also built silences deep enough to bury generations. The concubines of Rome rarely appear in its histories. No triumphal arch bears their names, no marble inscription records their lives. They were erased twice, first by the system that consumed their youth, and then by the storytellers who chose not to write them down. And yet traces remain, bones in shallow graves graffiti, scratched on villa walls, contracts of sale that reduce a human life to a sum of denarii. These fragments speak against the silence whispering that behind Rome's glory were lives measured not in years of choice, but in years stolen. Archaeology, law, and imagination together piece the story back. A femur showing repeated trauma, the brand seared into bone. The faint signature of a master attesting to ownership. Each artifact is a refusal of erasure. They remind us that even when empires forget, the earth remembers. Rome wanted its concubines to vanish into anonymity, to exist only as adornments when beautiful and as refuse when no longer useful. But the fragments say otherwise. They insist that they lived, that they suffered, that they mattered. The legacy is not only Roman, it is human. Again and again, societies have hidden their luxuries behind the labor and suffering of the vulnerable. We admire the art, the philosophy, the architecture, while averting our eyes from the costs paid in silence. Rome's concubines expose this pattern with merciless clarity. They force us to ask, what splendors in our own time are purchased at the price of forgotten lives? Who today is being erased so that others may display power without conscience? Modern parallels are uncomfortable, but undeniable. From sweatshops stitching garments for fashion houses to trafficked children forced into servitude, the structure of exploitation repeats. The details change. The villas become corporations, the auctions become shadow networks. But the logic remains profit and prestige at the expense of the powerless. Remembering Rome's concubines is not an exercise in distant pity. It is a mirror reflecting the dynamics we still allow. The central question lingers. What does it mean when civilization's greatness is built on silence and pain? Rome offered one answer. It meant that the empire thrived, but at the cost of countless erased lives. Our answer remains unwritten. History does not demand perfection, but it does demand memory. To remember the concubines is to resist the erasure they endured. To speak their story is to deny the silence Rome imposed. Their legacy is not in monuments or texts, but in our willingness to see them at last. They remind us that glory without justice corrodes, that luxury without dignity destroys, and that a society's true measure lies not in its splendor, but in how it treats those with no voice. The concubines of Rome lived without recognition, but they need not be forgotten. In telling their story, we restore to them the dignity Rome denied and confront ourselves with the cost of greatness. And so when we look at Rome's ruins, the arches, the theatres, the palaces, we must also see the shadows. For every marble column, a silenced voice. For every triumph, a youth discarded. The empire's brilliance and its brutality cannot be separated. The question left to us is not only what Rome was, but what we are willing to see when the ledger of history is opened. If you value the work of uncovering hidden histories, of giving voice to those silenced in life, subscribe and share your thoughts. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak, and it is our task to listen.